Clicked on this video, there's a good chance that you're into torture and BDSM, and if that's what you came for, don't leave. I am always willing to put myself at great risk for the sake of comedy, and I'm willing to do the exact same to you. I tortured myself making this video, and I'd like you to follow me on my journey. So without further ado, here's part 1 of my one-day Fox News challenge. I started my Fox News journey at 11 o'clock with Fox's special report on the funeral of legendary civil rights leader John Lewis. The program was actually pretty interesting. It was respectful and well reported. Donna Brazile and a couple of other guests came on to speak about his life and legacy. There were also reports during the service of Herman Cain's death from coronavirus. He was a candidate for the Republican presidential nomination back in 2011, campaigning on what he called a 999 tax plan, a name that was likely chosen to match the staleness of his rich white Republican opponents. His campaign fell flat after 4 credible sexual assault allegations and admittance of a 13-year affair. These scandals resulted in a sharp drop in polling numbers, which is sort of confusing as the party nominated Mitt Romney, a Mormon who moved to Mexico for a short period to practice polygamy. Also, he frequently claimed the virus was a hoax and attended Trump's no-mask rally in Tulsa. Folks, if there is any better proof of the theory of natural selection, I've yet to find it. Unfortunately, I had to take a break for medical issues, and I almost needed to go to the emergency room, but the evening news isn't too important anyway. I came back at 3 o'clock after resting for a small bit. Bill Hemmer's show started off talking to Betsy DeVos about reopening schools. DeVos, who is a billionaire who has never taught a child, condemned striking teachers because there is no data that suggests going back to school is dangerous. Which is, frankly, bullshit. If my school cannot clean a doo-doo off the toilet seat for 3 days, I do not trust it to keep me from the virus. There was a doo-doo on the toilet seat. And how much harder do you think it is to clean an invisible virus from every surface than to just pick up a doo-doo and drop it in the toilet? Bill completely softballed her, asking her questions from the frame of why schools should reopen. He had little resistance to anything she said and let her dance around questions, as is typical for most Fox News hosts. Next up, the Surgeon General talked about convalescent plasma to help cure coronavirus at a Red Cross conference with the president and other officials, which is actually kind of interesting. Unfortunately, many of the speakers at the conference were private healthcare executives, so it seems that the Trump administration is only flip-flopping on COVID because it's suddenly profitable and in the interest of Big Pharma. One thing I picked up quickly was just how little unique input and actual news I got from Bill and his guests. Their health correspondent Mark Siegel was brought in to interrupt the conference 3 different times, but he never had actual input. He repeated how tremendous and important and key and major this all was, but he never said anything other than how positive his opinion was. The conference itself was interesting, though, and gave me a lot of information, aside from the frequent interruptions to give Trump some sloppy dome under the table. But what is Mark Siegel's history on coronavirus reporting? Well, Mark has frequently called for the reopening of the country, praised Trump's handling of the coronavirus, and criticized the CDC of trying to knock the president and his team. I wouldn't exactly consider him to be a non-biased, medicine-focused guest, but he also has a title, so people don't bat an eye. They accept it and keep their eyes pasted to the screen. This is the first tactic that Fox News uses to keep you watching. The keeping of suspense when there is none. Here's an older example. In 2004, at the beginning of the Anthony Weiner scandal, Nancy Pelosi held a highly anticipated press conference. Fox News and the other 24-hour news stations were rubbing on the leg for it. And at the beginning of the conference, Nancy Pelosi explicitly said, "I will not talk about Anthony Weiner." And what did the journalists covering it do? They left. They scrammed out of the briefing. The cameras turned off and they went to other sensationalized news. "Why won't she talk about Weiner?" they said. "What's she doing with Weiner? We want to see Weiner. We need Weiner. I need Weiner." Guest Josh Holmes came on to speak about Pelosi's refusal to make any deals on the coronavirus unemployment bill. They presented him as the CEO of Cavalry LLC, a business consultation firm, which isn't wrong, but some information about him was curiously left out. Because he was talking about Mitch McConnell, one might assume that they would bring up the fact that he was Mitch McConnell's chief of staff and staff director, as well as a director for the RNC and consultant for 3 other Republican Senate campaigns. Isn't that an important, crazy little fact? A fun little tidbit? Anyway, on Neil Cavuto's Business Hour, Mick Mulvaney came on to talk down Democrats' pushes to keep unemployment benefits, whining that Medicare and welfare make up the most of the budget, which is bullshit, by the way. The military makes up the largest slice of spending, with a $700 billion war budget of world conquest proportions, and that $600 of unemployment would add too much to the deficit, which, by the way, doesn't matter because the U.S. has sovereign control over its debt, inflation, and currency. See modern monetary theory. But he doesn't care about that. He knows that it will never affect him. He's a fucking millionaire.
You're on.
Neil and his guests also talk about the protests using loaded language about the police keeping the peace and the radical anarchist Black Lives Matter protesters lighting things on fire and breaking things and beating people just to prove a point. Well, I love radical anarchists. They're my comrades. But when Boomer Fox viewers hear anarchists, they think violent criminals and arsonists, even though anarchism is a distinct philosophy and socioeconomic system, whatever. What matters is that Fox anchors and commentators like to use loaded language and euphemisms to give you a made-up perspective of something that doesn't even exist. We'll explore this more in the next part of the video.
You're on.
I've been convinced that the hosts and commentators are given talking points to look at. At 3 different times today, from 3 people, I've heard something along the lines of, the majority of the protesters who are peaceful, not the anarchists and agitators, can declare victory now by just going home. I don't think I have to tell most of you why this is just blatantly wrong, but when people hear it so many times passing by while they stare at a screen, do they just accept that it's true? In their internal discourse with what they're hearing, the limited amount that they have, the window of discussion has shifted, and that statement has just become accepted as fact. In 1980, Ted Turner and the Turner Broadcasting System introduced CNN, a 24-hour news station. Whereas most news stations at the time had morning news, evening news, and nightly news, CNN broadcasted for 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. 40 years later, it's the norm, and CNN competes with MSNBC and Fox News for viewers. But is there really enough news to dedicate 24 hours to? Is there enough going on in the world to create a full day of unique, succinct, factual reporting? Simply, no. The events that 24-hour news works for is world-changing events like 9/11. 9/11 warranted constant updates and coverage. Post 9/11, there have been no events that have made that necessary, and with the same few events to report on each day, channels need to find the solutions to 2 major problems. 1, how do we pack a few events into 24 hours of content? And how do we differentiate that content from other channels? The answer to both is surprisingly simple: sensationalism. To keep viewers tuned into events that would otherwise be repetitive mundanity, the 24-hour news channels pack in exciting or shocking language and imagery to provoke responses in a viewer's mind. Instead of reporting, it becomes a soap opera of fake conflict and speculation on exaggerated events. This is how Fox's evening news exploits your fears and attention spans to manipulate you into believing what they say. There's so much shoved at you that there's no time to object to it. I only covered a small slice of what was reported. I just couldn't cover everything else. But why would I choose to talk about Fox News? Why not, say, CNN or MSNBC? They have the same problems, do they not? Well, not quite. Let me explain. Due to the profit motive of media, which is for a completely different video, modern mainstream journalism is written around 2 things: laziness and sensationalism. These 2 things, in combination, maximize profit and minimize expenses. This applies to the New York Times, the Washington Post, CNN, MSNBC, and the like. But networks like Fox, networks like OAN, the Epoch Times, they have another quality that makes them unique. They're driven more by agenda and propaganda. Their main funders, they aren't advertisers like Liberty Mutual or Procter & Gamble. They're propagandist think tanks like the Hoover Institution or the Remain and Koch brother. They keep you watching with sensationalism and feed you propaganda on the exact same spoon. So I'm being a bit of a doomer here. Surely I have a solution, right? Well, it's not quite that simple. It's a hard question to tackle, and there's no one right answer, but we think we've found one. Instead of reporting the news, we're going to make it.